Hello, everyone, and welcome to the presentation today. It's called The Future of Pet Care, Global Trends and Opportunities. My name is Koerten. I'm the head of our global pet care research at Euromonitor International. Definitely miss being at the expo this year down in Florida, but this is, I think, a really great way of sort of having us engage during the current pandemic. And then hopefully, next year or down the line, we will see each other in person again soon. But thank you for taking the time to come and listen to the presentation. Hopefully, you'll learn something new about the industry and come away with some new insights as we think about moving forward from this pandemic. Just a very brief background about Euromonitor for those of you who are unfamiliar. Euromonitor is a leading provider of strategic market research and analysis on a global scale. We now have 15 office locations worldwide. We work with analysts on the ground conducting research in 100 markets around the globe, really across the CPG spectrum of consumer packaged goods. We complement our research with socioeconomic and demographic data on more than 210 markets, and this really provides that high-level overview and that sort of bird's eye perspective in terms of what's driving these markets, what's sort of moving and shaking the industry, and we have that both at the local and at the global level here. So today I'll be pulling data and insights from Passport, which is our syndicated market research database, to talk through trends in the global pet care industry. If you have questions, feel free to send me a note here on the platform. Some of my colleagues also are on the platform during the show, and we'd be happy to connect you with some of our resources. All right, in terms of the presentation today, we'll start off with an introduction. We'll talk about sort of the direction of the industry, sort of the growth and how things were evolving. We'll talk a little bit then about the pandemic, how that came in and sort of created a lot of uncertainty in the market and some of the factors that were driving change here. Then we're going to look at three major areas of shift and change that I want to dig into here specifically. The first being channel shifts. Then we'll talk quite a bit about food formats and how that's evolving pretty quickly. And then we'll wrap up with a discussion of a trend that's still very, very relevant in the industry here, even amidst the pandemic, and that is sustainability. So again, let's start off sort of an introduction here, where we were coming into the pandemic, what happened with the pandemic, and then how has that changed the overall trajectory of the global pet care industry. Well, when we think about the pre-pandemic pet care market here, this graph looks at the performance of the industry. The dark blue bar is the market size of global pet care sales, going all the way back here for a decade to 2011. The light blue line there shows the year-on-year growth rate over that span. And, obviously continued growth has been a story of the industry now for many, many years. But what's really interesting is not only is the industry growing, but if you look at that blue line, that growth has actually been accelerating here coming into the latest years. In fact, 2019 was the single fastest growth rate the industry had seen in a decade. This is something that, again, the industry continues to sort of show that positive resilience, that strong performance, and that accelerating growth coming into the pandemic. And I think that's something that we've really come to know and almost take for granted in many cases in the pet care industry, is just, this strong, consistent, accelerating growth that we see year in and year out. Now, when we talk about this growth, I really want to note that this is largely a story of premiumization, of dollar growth or value growth. And this has come from people trading up to higher quality and higher priced pet food and pet products. We see this very clearly if we just look at the average price, that consumers have paid for pet food over the past decade. You can see we've gone from just over $2.50 a kilo. Now we're approaching $3.50. That's growth of nearly 35% in that average price over the past decade or so. And we can see a lot of this, again, is the idea of people trading up to higher price or higher quality offerings. We segment our pet food data into three segments: economy foods, mid-price foods, and premium foods based on their pricing. And we can see that, again, over the last 5 years or so, significant growth. By far, the leader here in terms of industry growth has been that premium segment. This is both on a volume basis, sort of that dark blue bar, as people trade and switch up and trade up to higher brands, or get a pet and then move into premium brands, and also in terms of average price, that light blue segment. So even within premium, people trading up to, say, super premium or even higher priced products within the premium segment, again, continuing to push the industry and the market forward. Now, I think it's important to sort of caveat that, the driver behind this whole premiumization trend is another you could call it, and that is pet humanization. The idea that, again, pets are treating their furry family members as just that, a member of the family. As part of our global consumer lifestyle survey, we asked about 23,000 consumers across 40 markets, how would you describe your pets? And you can see that the various responses here. Here I've taken those responses, I've segmented them by age, and these results literally just came in. This is our 2021 survey. It's publishing here, just published in sort of mid-March. So again, very hot off the press, fresh data here in terms of those respondents. The first takeaway you'll see here is just how prevalent the respondents are here in this bucket here. Pets are a beloved member of the family. Again, my favorite term there is fur baby. I think that exemplifies this very, very well. But just look at the numbers here. We're looking at 65, 67, over 70% here of consumers saying, yeah, that pet is literally a beloved member of my family. And that really embodies what's been driving the industry forward. The other thing to note here is as you look across those age demographics, as you move from the older consumers to the younger consumers, 60 plus, the 45 to 59, especially those, millennial and Gen Z consumers, there's a clear pattern here, right? Those younger consumers are going to be most likely to be aligned and bought into these pet humanization trends than any other generation. So as we think about the future, as we think about, the millennial and Gen Z consumers coming up to be the next major group of pet owners in the industry, we can see just how bright the outlook is, right? These consumers are very bought into these trends. They're very interested in trading up, buying higher priced, higher quality products. And that bodes, again, very well for the future direction and growth of the pet care industry. So that's sort of, where we are. Obviously, the industry, as I said, was strong, it was resilient, it was growing, it was accelerating. And then the pandemic hit. And of course, that threw a lot of things into flux. It led to a lot of uncertainty and led a lot of industry observers to say, what's going to happen here, right? We've thought the industry has been recession resistant in the past, but this is really a challenge that we haven't seen in our lifetimes here for the modern pet care industry. So we've sort of found 4 areas of impact here where we think that, the pandemic really affected what the pet care industry looked like in 2020. The first, of course, is the macro environment. We're facing, a severe economic recession, a downturn many orders of magnitude worse than we saw during the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And so, yes, the industry had been recession resistant, but what would it do now in the face of this more severe downturn? Would there be an increased focus on value for money and premium private label? And we'll talk about that a bit later in the presentation, as well as, how do people respond when it comes to pet care spending? What is the income elasticity in terms of spending, and how do consumers respond when their incomes drop in terms of the pet care industry? Second area of impact is supply chain, right? Trying to get product to shelf in the midst of a global health crisis in the middle of a global pandemic can be a bit of a challenge. And so there were definitely supply chain pressures we saw here in terms of, workers getting sick, labor issues, sourcing ingredients and raw materials and trying to bring those to market and manufacture the product. Border controls, cross-border flow is definitely a challenge in the middle of a global pandemic. And, production costs, buying PPE and seeing inflationary pressures with commodities, definitely something that was very relevant for the pandemic here in 2020 as well. Channel shifts. Again, we're going to spend a whole section on this, so I don't want to talk too much about it now, but this is one of the biggest areas of impact as we saw huge shifts in sort of shopping and buying behavior in the midst of this pandemic. And then finally, one of the most important sort of long-term drivers we've seen here is pet ownership, right? People were stuck at home more than they ever have been before. And so there's a lot of social isolationism and people needing companionship that pets can provide. So we saw a lot of interest in pet adoptions or pet fostering. We saw significant more time spent at home with pets, both new and existing, creating new opportunities for bonding and treating occasions and all those sorts of things. And then in some markets, we did see some pet abandonments and some misinformation coming out about that. So it wasn't necessarily a universal trend, but definitely one that was very relevant really globally here amidst the pandemic. And at the end of the day, when we stepped back and we started to measure these factors and see how they were all impacting pet care in 2020, we found that the industry, again, remained highly recession resistant in 2020. I guess I said you can call it almost pandemic resistant at this point. But what we found is that those positive factors that I've mentioned, the pet adoptions, the fostering, the new pet bonding, that increased treating time, the humanization trends, some of the higher prices and higher costs coming along the line there significantly outweighed the negative negative drivers. We saw with income effects, we talked about income elasticity. The pet care industry is highly inelastic, right? When people's incomes fall, they are very unlikely to cut back significantly on their pet care spending. Again, because that pet is like one of their children, it's a member of the family. They're willing to cut back in other places to make it work. And so overall, the positive drivers significantly outweigh those negative drivers. And so when we look at the year-on-year growth here for real GDP, which is the dark blue line, you see just how steep of a decline we saw here in 2020. But you look at the total pet care industry, year-on-year growth, the light blue line, you could see it jump here. Again, the strongest growth rate we've seen in our entire historic period of tracking this at Euromonitor for decade plus here. The strongest growth we've seen as, again, the industry really rose to the occasion, and a lot of these positive factors had a very positive impact on growth rates, and again, much more than we saw with those negative drivers in 2020. All right, so let's turn to our next sort of area of focus here, and that is the channel shifts. Again, one of the biggest single impacts we saw from the pandemic. And I've called this amplified channel shifts because in many ways it sort of accelerated or furthered channel shifts that were already ongoing in the industry. This wasn't a normal recession, right? This wasn't a typical economic downturn in that, we were stuck in our homes. The sort of complete collapse in consumer mobility is really unprecedented with any other type of recession that we've seen. This graph here uses Google mobility data, mobile phone location data, to track how mobile consumers were across the world's largest 12 pet care markets. And I'm looking here specifically at traffic to retail and recreation sites, shopping malls, strip malls, places where pet stores are very prominent. And you can see just how steep of a decline we saw here in terms of that mobility decline, 50, 60% decline into March and April. And then, as we rebounded through the summer, we're still at negative double digits. Then there's new variants, new strains. And again, we see another sort of downturn here as we move into 2021 with continued lockdowns and new quarantines. And so this really affected the channel environment. If we look at the pet shops and superstores channel, the pet specialty space, that channel is highly dependent on foot traffic. Right? You don't go there usually to buy groceries and other items. You're going there specifically to make pet care purchases. And so when traffic collapses here, and when you're not leaving your home, you're only making essential purchases. That was a channel that really struggled with a sort of lack of foot traffic for physical purchases in 2020. At the same time, people wanting to distance from others and remain, socially distant from others during the pandemic led to a huge lift in the digital space. E-commerce was sort of our lifeline here in 2020. Everything went online, right? We were online for work, for school, for socializing. Obviously we're online here for the conference. So really digital became our lifeline in 2020. And that definitely came through in the e-commerce channel, which saw tremendous growth here during the pandemic. It was really the big winner in terms of the channel shifts. Now, it's important to sort of realize that the industry wasn't necessarily ready for this type of shift, at least in terms of the speed and magnitude in which we saw the shift online. We have a new VIA, it's our online web extraction data tracking tool. And here we can, looking at data across many online retailers, we can look at the number of SKUs that are out of stock on major online retail websites. And here I'm looking across Western Europe at the number of dog food SKUs that were out of stock during the early stages of the pandemic. And we can see that, traditionally the average out of stock rate's around 5%, but as the pandemic picked up, as people surged to e-commerce, as everyone went online to buy their products, that number jumped, more than nearly 3 times that level in terms of the online out of stock rate during the early stages of the pandemic. It's worth noting this wasn't necessarily a global trend. This light blue line shows the first 10 weeks of the pandemic in Western Europe. You can see how it kind of mirrors the graph over here, but the dark blue line shows that trend in Asia. And you can see during the pandemic's early stages in Asia, the out of stock stayed very low and actually went down a little bit as e-commerce retailers adapted and expanded their capacity. And a lot of this just came down to sort of how ready the online infrastructure was for this type of shift. In 2019, e-commerce sales made up nearly a third of the entire industry in Asia. In Western Europe, that number was only 10%. So again, a much sort of stronger infrastructure, more built out capabilities for e-commerce in Asia led the region to respond much more in terms of much more agility than we saw within Western Europe. And we think about e-commerce too. I think it's really important to identify sort of this new guard that's emerging in the online space. It's not the same old in terms of who's who online. Traditionally, the ship to home model dominated in the pet care industry. You think about Amazon or Zooplus or Chewy or Alibaba. I order the products online, they're then shipped to my doorstep like, a lot of traditional e-commerce purchases. Well, during the pandemic, when a lot of these retailers were seeing shipment delays or out of stocks or those types of things, a lot of customers turn to sort of alternative fulfillment models during this time, looking at click and collect. A huge surge in click and collect growth at the Targets and the Walmarts and the Carrefours of the world, as this new model served as a very efficient sort of fill-in model for e-commerce during the pandemic. People driving up, staying in their car, and having it dropped in their trunk. Third-party delivery services. We think about Rappi or Shipt or Instacart or Uber Grocery. A lot of these saw huge lifts, during the pandemic. I think Glovo in Europe had like 600% growth in their grocery service during the pandemic here, as people turned to some of these services to stay out of stores and to remain safe again during the pandemic. And then direct to consumer. A lot of people saying, I don't necessarily have to go through a third party. I can go directly to some of these upstart brands that have their own direct to consumer sites and just get it shipped directly to my home that way. What's really interesting too is a lot of these models we think are going to be very sticky. This online shift is going to persist as we move into the future. Nearly 70% of Chewy's total sales came from its auto ship customers in the last quarter. For Zooplus, that number is now at 50% of sales coming from their subscribe and save customers. These subscription models, these auto ship models, tend to be very sticky. There's a lot of inertia. You sign up for it, it's very convenient, you save more money, and the products automatically come to your doorstep on a recurring basis. And so moving forward, we think a lot of this is going to stick. It's going to persist as people discover the convenience and realize the time savings that are offered by these types of models. And so longer term, we think the outlook is still very bright. Even after this huge lift in 2020, we think penetration will continue to grow moving forward. A couple of examples here, I think, that embody this really well in terms of examples here. This is Jaffe in France. It's one of those direct-to-consumer brands that I talked about. It's a product that has that whole personalization element. They put your pet's name on the bag as they send it to you. It's locally made, specifically customized formula, very attractive packaging. Essentially a premium tails.com in the French market, and that's one of those sort of fast-growing direct-to-consumer brands that have really popped up recently here. And then another example of sort of the subscription model, the sticky model in Norway, Dyrekassen here, they set recurring delivery plan as the default. Once you log on, once you make your first purchase, you are automatically enrolled in their recurring delivery plan. You get every 10th shipment free as part of that plan. And again, that's going to be sticky. That's going to persist as people sign up. They discover the savings, the convenience. That type of model has seen a lot of traction and will continue to grow as we think about the future. A couple other things to think about here. We're calling it sort of the new shopping mission in terms of how people are navigating stores once they are actually in physical stores. And one of those things to sort of keep in mind here is the role of automation in retail. We were talking a lot about Amazon Go coming into this pandemic. It was very trendy to talk about this cashierless format in retail, and it was kind of the future. Well, you haven't heard as much about it now with the pandemic, but in many ways, this sort of contact-free, highly efficient shopping model is even more relevant now in a post-pandemic world. And we already see it with NowPet, sort of an automated pet store model in Israel. And the question becomes, what happens to front-end merchandising? What happens to the check lanes? You have little containers of treats or toys or those types of things, promotions there. But if there is no checkout, you're monitored by cameras, you're charged when you leave. What happens in this new world of a more automated retail environment? What happens with the new trip mission? Right, Misty and Murray in Finland has a really unique pet loyalty program. As you spend time in their stores, the dog's RFID collar sends a signal to the store sensors, and it says, you're earning one loyalty point for every minute you spend in our store, because they know you spend more time, you find more products, you discover more things, and you buy more. But in this sort of midterm post-pandemic world, we've seen a lot more purpose-driven trips. People aren't interested in going and spending a whole afternoon at a pet store and exposing themselves to a whole range of people. It's more, I want to get in there, I want to get what I need, and then I want to get out. So what does that mean for less browsing, for less time on new product discovery, again, for those in-store promotions? So what does this sort of new trip mission look like here in the intermediate term? And that's something we're watching very closely. And then finally, digital engagement. Again, if everyone's shopping online, how do we start to engage with customers? How do we create that community, that engagement, that information about our brands? A lot of this is going to go online. So we've seen a huge boom in the live streaming market in China. Taobao Live, people going online, learning about products, getting entertained, watching videos of people's pets. And so I think a lot of this engagement now going through your phone is going to be kind of the future here. And so the question is, what does this look like as it expands into more markets? And then finally, outside of this, I think we look at the channel landscape. There's a lot of potential here for private label products. When we think about sort of the retail environment, I think private label often goes hand in hand with that. We think there's still a lot of potential here for the future of private label in pet food. We've asked consumers, and I love this survey, which features or attributes do you look for when you're buying packaged food? And you might think, well, health or taste or artificial flavors, those types of things. No, number one with a bullet, value for money. It's the most important feature of any that consumers report in terms of their number one attribute when they're looking at food products. If you think about this question, the answer down here, strong or well-known brand, that's much, much lower on the list. And so what we've seen now in this sort of post-pandemic period where we're going to have a lot of sort of these K-shaped recovery curves, a lot more interest in sort of stretching your dollar, value for money, and getting that type of value in the industry, I think that's something that will continue to draw consumers to private label, particularly premium private labels that can offer a lot of the traits and benefits that premium brands have, but at a lower price point. We're seeing this really across the industry, right? Whether it's a variety stores like Euromonitor in Norway or pet specialty or e-commerce, whether it's functional foods, ancestral diets, just premium positioning. We're seeing a lot of innovation within premium private label, and we're seeing it really move the needle. If you look at Zooplus, for instance, in Europe, their private label sales have grown 331% over the past 5 years. They saw a big lift in 2020 with the pandemic. So I think this is something that the industry is still watching very closely in terms of what is the potential for this premium private label and what does it mean in a post-pandemic period. All right, let's turn our attention now to the next section here, and that is looking at the evolution of food formats and how that stands to change, how it already is changing, and what that might look like in sort of a post-pandemic environment as well. So what we've seen here is really, when we talk about premium pet food, we've seen this sort of historic progression when it comes to premium pet food traits. If you go all the way back to the 2000s, right, much of premium pet food was about functionality, right? IAM's premium protection. This product has been tailor-made for your puppy. It will give it the exact nutrition it needs, and as such is a premium offering in the space. About a decade later, we had this shift. We had this move towards sort of this clean label revolution. We saw it in human food. We saw it in pet food as well, where it really became all about the ingredient list, right? The true blue challenge, where we have, the IAMS bag on the left, someone's reading the ingredient list and they're seeing sorghum and byproduct meal. And of course, the blue owner on the right says chicken, rice, and oatmeal. And at the end, the dog drags its little bed across the screen and wants to come over here on the blue buffalo side. So it really became about ingredient lists. What were the specific ingredients in there? Did I know them? Can I pronounce them? Grain-free sort of rose with this as well. And this clean label shift really affected what premium pet food meant here in starting around the 2010s. But as we move forward into the 2020s and beyond, I think we're on the verge of another sort of transformational shift here in the premium end of the pet food market. So we think about, not just the ingredient list now, we're starting to think about what does that food actually look like? What is the physical format of that food? And sort of to the farmer's dog point here, dog food should look like food, not burnt brown balls. And so in addition to the ingredient list, which is still going to be important, the actual end format, the physical appearance of that food is going to take on an increasingly important role here in the future of what premium food looks like. So we think about sort of what the industry traditionally looks like in terms of kibble manufacturing, right? It's a very well-defined 6-stage process in terms of how you manufacture dry pet food. And a lot of the focus on premiumization in the past has been on the first step, ingredient curation, right? Getting organic ingredients, getting novel proteins, getting superfoods, functional foods, all those types of things. There's also been a lot of innovation and focus on the packaging side of things, right? How do I make that product pop on the shelf, right? Is it wilderness scenes or ingredient images or a picture of a wolf on there? What sort of draws the consumer from a packaging standpoint? But there's been a little bit less attention paid to these middle steps. And that's where I'm talking about here, sort of what is the end appearance? What does the end format of that food look like when we sort of move away from the traditional grinding and preconditioning and extruding of that we see within the traditional kibble space? And so this leads to sort of what I'm calling here the kibble disconnect, right? When you look at this increasing disconnect between a package that shows big chunks of fresh ingredients and vegetables and fruits, that shows again these beautiful open wilderness scenes or claims about all these meat-rich formulas that are going into it, but then the consumer opens the package, and at the end of the day, it's very similar in terms of the final product format, right? The traditional kibble has changed a lot less here in terms of that positioning here on the premium end. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for what I'm calling these new processing methods in terms of the future of the industry here. We're seeing a lot of growth, a lot of interest in these already. We talk about raw foods, whether they're frozen or freeze-dried, continues to be a major growth frontier for the industry. A lot of these freshly cooked foods are coming in. I think those are very appealing as well. And then sort of this new wet food, I'm calling it, these stews, these broths, these soups, these purees, these products, again, that look very, very much like human food on the wet side of the industry. And I think that's something we're going to continue to watch as well. So look at the first of these. Let's start with that new wet side of the industry here. When we look at wet food more generally, we know it's growing. It's really been accelerating here. Last 2 years, wet food has outgrown dry food in the US by a factor of more than 2. It's grown twice as fast as dry food over here over the last 2 years. And when you look at the format of some of those wet foods, we can see that the traditional metal can, which is often associated with highly processed foods, has been losing share in both the US and Western Europe. It's lost 3.5 full share points just in the past 5 years to a lot more of these, these containers, these pouches, these very fresher looking products that look again like something I would put my leftovers in after I finished a meal. And again, that VIA database, that really powerful web extraction tool where we can look at how many products are out there, what types of claims do they make, how many SKUs are available on different sites. And here I've gone back through the last 4 years, and I'm looking at the number of products that are classified as soups, purees, or pâtés in the US of the total online pet food universe from 2017 to 2021. And this is looking at as a share of total all online SKUs over that span, about 50,000 or 60,000 total SKUs over the span here. And you can see that share continue to rise each and every year. More and more interest, more and more consumers turning to these new age wet foods. And so, yeah, this consumer interest, this demand is drawing consumers to these new humanized formats, and it's really changing the trajectory of product innovation in the industry when it comes to the wet side of the business. The second area to talk about here is these new processing methods, is the fresh cooked food, sort of like the farmer's dog example that I talked about earlier. The big selling point here is this food literally looks like food that you or I would eat. I love the bowl image here, right? On one side is meat and veggies. I completely recognize what all those are. On the right side is what it looks like in pet food format. And look, I can still see the carrots. I can still see the parsley. I can still see all the products there in that recipe. And in cooking this product, using sort of this fresh cooking process, these products use no preservatives, and they use refrigeration or freezing to preserve the product. And they don't have to use any other preservatives in that sense. We have seen these products out for a while, right? And I love, the tested on humans, and of course the personalized plan element, again, looking like human food. And we have seen these for years, right? Fresh Pet in the US is a great example. They're now in, they have 23,000 of their own Fresh Pet fridge locations, approaching 500 million in sales. If you look at Australasia, the Real Pet Food Company has been a huge player in the space for a long time, but it's a logistical challenge, right? Building 23,000 of these Fresh Pet fridge locations is an expensive endeavor. It's not a light, an endeavor in terms of capital investment. And anytime you start talking about involving a cold chain distribution, structure with, at the retail level or at the distribution level, especially in pet specialty stores, which traditionally sell all sort of shelf-stable products and don't have a lot of refrigeration capabilities, it's definitely a challenge to get these products out in a wider arena. But the real game changer here is e-commerce. And we've seen now a whole host of innovators coming in the space, really across the globe, that are saying, we can do freshly cooked pet food. We can customize it and everything, and we'll just send it directly to your door. Much like if you were buying kibble, or if you were buying canned wet food, or any other type of food, it would have to be shipped to your door anyway. And so with some creative packaging and some cold packs, we can get that to your door. It can be fresh. We can do it on a subscription, And it really opens the playing field to these new formats. It levels the playing field in a significant way and suddenly makes freshly cooked pet food instantly more accessible to a much wider consumer base. So as we look at the future, as we talked about this massive digital uplift we saw from the pandemic, we think that these freshly cooked foods have a ton of potential as they move into these new business models of the direct-to-consumer world when it comes to e-commerce. The third area here that we talk about within this new food formats is raw food, this biologically appropriate raw food. Now, when we look at the motivation for serving raw food, it's very, very different than what we just talked about, right? It's not because the food looks like what I would eat, right? It's literally big chunks of raw meat. I don't eat that on a daily basis. I don't think any of us do. So it's not so much that it looks like what we eat. It's about what's biologically appropriate for that pet. In fact, when we asked humans, do you eat any of these following diets? Raw food diets are very, very low, like between 3 and 4% of all global respondents are eating a raw food diet themselves. So it's not, again, that I want that pet to eat exactly what I'm doing. It doesn't have to be in a plastic container that looks like my leftovers. It's more of, do you follow any of these diets? It's more of that pet needs that for the biologically appropriate reasons. And one of the biggest drivers of shift here, once again, is that shift to e-commerce and that shift to new formats. So e-commerce, just like with fresh food, suddenly now raw food becomes instantly more accessible. You could send it to anyone's door, just like you would with any other type of food. But also freeze drying has been a major source of innovation here in the raw food space. Traditionally, you'd have to have a freezer unit here, and selling these products to consumers through an in-store freezer, which is definitely, a challenge and has a lot of those expenses that we talked about. When you freeze dry it, it becomes shelf stable, and it becomes very easy to sell in a wide range of environments, including, all sort of e-commerce sites. And so when we look at moving from a Rambala in Peru to more of a barf box in Thailand, where it's shelf stable, freeze dried, that is a product that suddenly has a much wider range of uses and can sell to a much wider consumer base. And finally, we've seen growing penetration, just like we saw with those soups, purees, and pâtés, looking at our VIA online database, pulling, again, millions of SKUs globally to look at sort of how these products compare across markets. The two biggest ones by far right now for freeze-dried raw is the US and China. And if you look at the penetration, again, of these freeze-dried products, 2019, 2020, and the 2021 year-to-date here through the first quarter, we can see, again, continued increases in penetration. Big jump here in 2020 for the Chinese market, but there's a lot of interest, and this continues to expand and sort of capture more and more share in this industry. One thing we have to keep in mind, I think, here, and we talk about this interest in raw food or freshly made food at home, there's a lot of potential for people to do it themselves, right? If this product is just fresh meat, I just sort of cook it myself, and I want to be a parent to that pet. I love cooking for my kids, so why don't I cook for my pet as well? There's a lot of potential here for people moving towards homemade pet foods, and you know exactly what's in it too if you're making it themselves. We ask consumers, do you feed your pet the following types of food on a daily basis? This is our brand new data, Health and Nutrition Survey 2021, just coming out now here, and we see that when you look at table scraps across leading markets, it's very common for people to feed table scraps to their pet, ranging somewhere in the realms of 10 to 25% across markets. But table scraps or leftovers is a very common practice among pet owners. And then if we ask, do you actually make your food from scratch? Do you do homemade food for your pet right now? Again, we're seeing, double-digit respondents in almost every market are doing this on a daily basis. Anywhere between 8 to 9 up to 12, 13% of pet owners say, yeah, I make my pet homemade food, on a regular basis. And that's something that, again, as we see more and more interest in these types of cuisines, there is potential for more homemade cuisines to make their way into pet food diets. Now, one of the challenges here is making that product complete and balanced, right? And making sure the pet has all the nutrition it needs. And so one potential we've seen here is in Hungary, we've seen Fanny's Barf Shop producing personalized recipes for their clients. You give us all the information about your pet, we'll create a raw food recipe for you, and then you can create that at home. We'll send you a packet of organic supplements to go with that, and then it'll be complete and balanced, and they have seen tremendous growth in that market with their efforts on this end. So a lot of interest, and something to keep in mind is the idea of home feeding when it comes to pet food. All right, with that, let's turn to our last section here, and that is on sustainability. Still a major area of frontier and growth here, even in the midst of the pandemic. This really hasn't faded in any significant extent here. In fact, when we looked at 2020, we said, despite the pandemic, do you still try to have a positive impact on the environment through your everyday actions? Nearly 7 in 10 pet owners said, yes, I do. I'm very interested in this sustainability and the sort of climate crisis we have. And what's really interesting is if you look at pet owners versus non-pet owners in the survey data, we see pet owners tend to, across the board, be more bought into this idea of buying sustainably produced items. So as the pet care industry, this is a big opportunity. We also see it across generations. This isn't just a millennial phenomenon anymore, right? This is something where across the board, pet owners from Gen Z all the way up to the boomers are saying, yeah, this is something I really want to buy sustainable, and I want to promote sustainability with all of my purchases. Now, one of the challenges we see with sustainability, and I call these sort of trends in tension, there's really two of them. And it's when we look at sort of other trends we're seeing in the industry relative to sustainability. And one of them has to do with the ancestral sort of meat-first diet that's become so popular in the industry, right? One of the problems with sort of a meat-heavy diet is one of the biggest sustainability trends is plant-based, right? People moving away from meat because of the carbon emissions. And so there's been a big focus on provenance in this space, right? Whether it's vegan foods, we're seeing more and more traction for vegan foods, whether it's sustainably produced meat products like MSC certified or wild caught products. We're seeing more and more of those make inroads in the market as people do prioritize protein sustainability. The other sort of trend in tension here has to do with packaging, right? We saw with pet humanization the shift towards these plastic containers and the shift towards wet food. And when you look at the overall numbers, we can see that even though dog and cat food, this shows the total number of packaging unit sales by industry over the past 5 years. And even though dog and cat food is much, much lower in terms of the number of packaging units it creates, in terms of growth, which is that little orange dot there, it's by far the leader, right? Between the industry's fast growth and these humanization trends, we're producing a lot more packaging unit sales than we had in the past. And at the same time, these humanization trends have moved the industry away from aluminum trays or metal food cans or recyclable paper content towards more plastic-based packaging, right? Pouches and plastic containers. And so the industry is producing more types of plastic containers that are harder to recycle by nature. And so that's one of the challenges I know the industry has really been working to create types of initiatives and recycling programs to try to push this forward. And I think that's another major frontier we're seeing in the sustainability space. A couple of examples here that I wanted to bring up of just how some of these innovators are working, some of the cool things they're doing. Edgard and Cooper in the Netherlands, they do some really cool stuff with their packaging. They use a potato-based bioplastic for their packaging, and they use paper that's Forest Stewardship Council certified. And it's really cool that they've attracted a lot of money. They attracted another 20 million pounds in private equity funding in November, and they're really out there to make a difference. And I think this is just a really cool example of one innovator that's doing some cool stuff in the space. These sort of circular models, we're seeing a lot of traction. Loop is probably the best known one, but I love this example from Switzerland, Hungry Pets. This is a direct-to-home delivery model in an all-electric vehicle fleet. They wash, they sterilize, they collect the containers, they reuse them, and they ship it to your house the next month. So, whether it's new materials, whether it's circular models, again, a lot of interest in the packaging side of sustainability. And then, of course, the protein side, the other trend and tension I mentioned. In Europe, we're seeing a lot of interest in innovation in insect-based proteins. Not as much yet in the US. There are a few examples in North America, but in Europe, this is an area there's been a lot of investment and a lot of innovation coming down the line. Eura in the UK was the first major insect-based pet food, and they say, the British Veterinary Association says the insect-rich pet food is better for their pets than steak. And so I think that's really interesting, and they call themselves the world's most sustainable dog food. And then a really great example from the German market. This is a product that is a carbon positive. They actually invest to offset more carbon than they produce. They measure it very, very to strict detail, and everything about them is becoming climate neutral and minimizing carbon emissions. All right, so we covered a lot today. Let's wrap it up. What are some of the key takeaways, some of the key findings we saw, and what do we have to think about moving forward? Well, first, we started off with sort of an introduction to see how the industry was performing and adapting in the midst of the pandemic. We saw that the pet industry, again, has really enjoyed that strong, consistent growth really across the CPG space. It's been a standout in this space. And this has been driven by humanization and premiumization as people trade up. A lot of uncertainty with the pandemic. People didn't really know what was going to happen, but we saw the real 4 areas of industry impact here with the economy, supply chains, channel shifts, and that new pet ownership trends that we're seeing in a lot of markets. We saw that, again, in addition to sort of new pets and fostering, we saw a lot more time at home spent with pets, bonding and treating and those types of things. And largely, these effects outweighed the negative impacts of the recession and led to a fantastic year for the pet care industry in 2020. We saw channel shifts are one of the biggest areas of change here as a result of the pandemic, right? E-commerce has been really the big winner here as specialists struggled, just given that collapse in consumer mobility during the recession. We saw that after a few initial hiccups in the online space, it's really sort of rebounded and they've done a good job. And we've seen a lot of disrupting new models emerging, whether it's click and collect, the automated subscription type programs or membership type programs that have a lot of potential to be sticky moving down the line. We talked about the new shopping mission, automated models, and the potential for premium private label during the sort of K-shaped recovery curve that we're expecting in the industry. So keep your eye on channel shifts to continue to evolve. This is one of the biggest areas of change we will see moving out of the pandemic. Then we talked about food formats and how a lot of what's happening in the premium food space continues to move more and more towards formats. A little bit less about packaging because, again, that the product format fundamentally remains the same. So we're seeing a lot of interest in the face of this sort of kibble disconnect with these new age wet formulas, these freshly cooked models, and these raw foods that continue to gain more and more traction amongst consumers, and how some of the channel shifts we talked about, whether it's the direct-to-consumer models, the subscription programs, really change the game and broaden the opportunity for a lot of these new food formats. And then finally, we saw how sustainability remains a very important trend despite the pandemic. Engaged pet owners, more so than non-pet owners, want brands with a purpose that are going to take action on sustainability challenges. The big challenges, of course, here being sort of meat-first protein sustainability with some of these ancestral pet diets, as well as the packaging elements, creating more sort of plastic-based packaging. And those are really the two challenges that the industry is working to address today. We saw some of the disruptors and some of the capital investment that's flowing into this space, but I think this will continue to be a major growth frontier as the industry moves into the future. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time. There's a link here that you can use if you're interested in downloading a copy of the presentation. Just go to that link and you're happy to send that to you. Otherwise, please reach out to myself or to some of my colleagues here during the show. Happy to touch base and answer any further questions you have. Thanks so much.